Welcome to the American Library in Paris, and thank you for joining us tonight for Evenings with an Author, sponsored by Grow at Annenberg. My name is Mayanne Wright, and I'm the docent here at the library. I give the history tours, and I help out with these evening events as well. So tonight, we are delighted to welcome scholar David Chaffetz, who will discuss his book, Raiders, Rulers, and Traders, which explores the transformative force of horses in shaping the world's civilizations. David will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. Sound good? All right. So David is an independent scholar with a lifelong passion for Middle Eastern and Asian history. His first book, A Journey Through Afghanistan, earned critical praise from Owen Latimore, the doyen of Inter-Asian Studies. David has contributed to the Asian Review of Books, the South China Morning Post, the Nikkei Asian Review, and Fortune. He belongs to the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, the Royal Asiatic Society in Hong Kong, the Gremio Literario in Lisbon, and the Explorers Club in New York. And he also serves on the advisory committee to the American Library in Paris. Please join me in welcoming David with a warm round of applause.
Good evening, and thank you. The horse of the steppe rides on and on, wrote Alexander Blok, the Russian symbolist poet. Blok was referring to the Russian Revolution of 1917, and for Blok, the horse of the steppe was a Vedic element that was either predicting the fate of Russia or even determining the fate of Russia. So tonight I'd like to talk to you about the horse, not as a means of transportation or as an element in sport or hobby, but as a decisive element of transformation in the destinies of nations, and is in this case tonight mostly Europe's destiny. A little bit about myself for those of you who don't know me. In 1976, I rode across Afghanistan with my college roommate Wiley Wood, and we spent half a year traveling with Afghan nomads and learning about their way of life, which was essentially based around the horse. And this gave me a lifelong interest in the peoples of Asia and the way in which they connected with horses. It took a while for me to develop this idea. I should also mention that I have been fascinated with Iran since I was a child. I had the golden treasury of myths and legends and these incredibly evocative illustrations of Iranian heroes of the Iranian national epic, Rustam and Sohrab, Esfandiar, Siyavush, all depicted here. So there was a reason why I went to Afghanistan in the first place, and that was that. Over the past 45 years, I've had the opportunity to travel in most of the countries in Asia which have a strong horse connection. It's easier if I tell you where I didn't go. I didn't go to Ukraine, which I greatly regret, or to Kazakhstan, which I hope to make up for. But since I've been living here in Paris off and on for 40 years, I'm also curious about the way in which the horse influenced the destiny of Europe. And that's a story which is perhaps not as well understood. And since we're here in Paris today, I thought I would talk mainly about the impact of the horse in European history, which is a subject I don't really go into in the book. So let's start with a map. So I could give a quiz here to anyone under the age of 30, and you might not know what this is a map of, seriously. But for the people our age, my age, I think we all immediately recognize that this is a map of the Iron Curtain, that all the countries in red were under Soviet domination until about 1990, correct? But this map shows a gap or a fissure in Europe between East and West, which is much older than the Soviet Empire or the Soviet sphere of influence. And I want to show you that that fissure is connected to the horse. Okay. If we look at what's behind that map, you see the invasions of the Mongols in the 13th century. Is it a coincidence that all the countries which wound up under Stalin's thumb in 1945 were also countries that had either been occupied by the Mongols or subject to Mongol invasion, taxation, and destruction? These two maps are almost overlaps of one another. And again, I will argue at the end tonight that that's not necessarily a coincidence. So to explain why the Eastern Europe has this strong influence from the East, I have to tell you the story of horses. I have to start out at the beginning, because I think without understanding what we call the ethology of horses, which is their biology, their sociology, their environmental requirements, it's difficult to explain how Eastern Europe and Western Europe became so different. So let's talk about the horse from the beginning. At the bottom of this little graph, you see a fellow who's about this big, looks like a big dog, and he's a forest feeder. So I guess he eats more or less what deer eat today. They live in dense forest cover. And then what happened is the Ice Age came along, and for much of the northern hemispheres, the forests disappeared. So the horse had to evolve into a steppe creature, which lived off of grass, and that had many important implications for how horses developed and how horses exist today. First of all, it grew from a small animal to a big animal, because on the steppe, in order to escape from predators, it had to run fast. It had to have a lot of muscle to run fast, and it had to extract the protein for that muscle from grass, which is very difficult. So the horse eats in the natural habitat 18 hours a day. It runs very fast and it's extremely muscled. Very powerful animal compared to many other livestock animals. Another thing about the horse is that it perspires to reduce its temperature like we do, and that's not common among animals, and as a result, most breeds of horses need a lot of water. So here you have an animal which eats constantly, which needs to drink fresh water frequently, and runs really fast. And you get an animal which takes up a huge amount of territory relative to some of the other animals that we have domesticated over time, like sheep, goats, and cows. They don't run fast. They can be pastured in a fairly small area, and they're just not these kind of semi-flying, almost divine beings that cover the whole steppe. So the horse has a very particular ethology. Just to give one example of the horse's need for space is that, remember, these animals started off in North America, and because they needed water and they needed grass, they wound up wandering all the way from today's Alaska to Portugal, where I live today. And remember, in those days, the entire band of land between Alaska and Portugal was kind of frosty steppe, something like northern Mongolia today. So they were very expansive animals. You could call them an invasive species. And maybe that's the clue as to why they invaded Europe. Now, during the Ice Age, our ancestors suddenly encountered these horses which had come in from North America, and we found that they were exceedingly good to eat because they're very dense protein, very low fat, easy to digest. We were talking about an all-meat diet. All-meat diet seems very difficult, but actually horse meat's extremely easy to eat and digest, and it's given to children and to elderly people in Mongolia with no bad health effects. So it became the favorite animal for us to hunt. That explains why, when you look at the cave paintings of the Ice Age period, a third of all the animals represented on the caves are horses. It also explains why a very large proportion of the bones of animal remains that we find in prehistoric campsites are horses. So it was probably the most popular animal well before we domesticated, simply because we enjoyed eating it. Now, we ate them so thoroughly that they disappeared from Western Europe, and Eastern Europe for that matter. By the end of the Ice Age, the horses had retreated to an area where there were not a lot of people, which is the Eurasian steppe, which I'll show you in a minute. And so eventually we had to learn to eat other things, and eventually we developed agriculture and we were no longer hunters. But the point is that we hunted the horses to extinction in Europe, and the horses survived by retreating into Eurasia. But they have their revenge, as we'll see in a second. I talked about this already. Those are the famous parietal works of art. They're extremely common. And by the way, these descriptions of animals are very accurate. The animal on the far right there, he has spears sticking out of him because our ancestors frequently depicted their hunts. So let's talk about the Eurasian steppe. It's hard to get a map that shows everything that at one hand and on the other hand is not hard to read. So I hope this map is not hard to read. The blue areas, which is Europe, India, and China, there's too much rain, so you naturally have forest, and then when human beings clear the forest, you have agricultural land. So these are bad places to raid horses for a number of reasons. There's too much rain, it's too hot, and mankind would rather use that land for the plow rather than pasture. In the middle, you see this big orangey area. Forget the far north because it's too cold. But in the temperate band of the orangey area, you have enough rain so that you don't have a desert condition, but you don't have enough rain for trees to grow normally. So these are the grasslands, and they extend essentially from the Great Wall of China or the frontiers of the Inner Mongolia all the way to Hungary. And this is where the horses retreated to when they were hunted to extinction in Western Europe. So the people who managed to live in the steppe continued to hunt these animals, but they didn't hunt them to extinction because in the meantime, they figured out how to milk them. So chronologically, we have been using goats, sheep, and cattle for cheese, yogurt, milk, etc., since about 7,500 years BC. So we knew how to milk animals, and it was only a matter of time before we figured out how to milk horses. But it took a long time because horses run fast. I mean, it's easier to chase after a sheep than it is to chase after a horse. A lot of people say to me, you know a lot about horses, but that's not a very profound thought, right? It's a lot easier to tame the sheep, the goat, and the cow because they can't run away to the same extent that horses can. So eventually, we figured out how to domesticate the horse and to exploit the mare's milk as an essential source of food, and that became the main source of food for the steppe people for 2,000 to 3,000 years. Now, because they had a very, and by the way, the reason why we ride horses is because you can't herd horses without riding them. So riding is a direct consequence of domesticating the horse. Okay, now the horse-breeding people, and this is what I want to draw your attention to mainly, they are very different from the people of China, of India, of Western Europe. What's the big difference between horse-breeding people and sedentary people? Horse-breeding people live very, very thinly spread out across the land. A family like this that might have 20 horses and maybe 100 sheep, goats, and cows would live in a group of about 30 people. And they would roam over and need the same pasture land as 3 times the city of Paris inside the walls. So just practically the whole Ile-de-France would only support 200 or 300 pastoralists. That's very different from living in a village in the Roman Empire or in the Han Empire, where all the land is marked out, you know who your neighbors are, there's a village headman, there's a local notable who controls everything, and society is very hierarchical and very sedentary. These people wander with the horses in search of grass and water, and it gives them a very different sociology. For one thing, they have to be self-organizing. There is no big chief, there's no village headman. They have to agree how to share the water, how to share the pasture among themselves. They have to have a way of relating to neighbors who are quite far away. They have to have rules, they have to have customs. This is probably the origin of the tribe. You don't find tribes so much in sedentary farming populations because there's no need for a tribe. The village is the tribe. But out in the steppe, you needed friends who would protect you against horse rustlers, horse stealers, and also against bride stealers, which is a big deal and still is a big deal in that part of the world. And by the same token, you needed friends who would help you steal the other guy's horses and steal the other guy's girls. So the tribe sort of evolved as a self-organizing principle for self-defense and organization in the steppe. And there are two other things that were very important that the horse breeders developed, which has big implications for our story. One of them is that they loved hunting. Remember, they were descended from hunters more directly than the sedentary people were. And the steppe in the old days was full of wonderful game, of antelope, of deer, of bisons. So similar to the American Indians, which we all remember, the steppe people loved to go hunting, and they organized very large-scale hunts where they would go for weeks or even a month at a time in search of additional protein and the fun of the hunt. This required a lot of organization as well. The second thing they did from an organizational point of view is they had to move their camps from the summer camp to the winter camp, which is typically a question of elevation. So even today, pastoralists move from mountain camps in the summer to valley camps in the winter. And when you think about the number of people involved in these movements, they had to have an almost military, and that's a clue, they had to have an almost military sense of organization to make sure that 10,000 animals could cross hundreds of miles without running into one another and without exhausting the pastures before they could get to the new pasture. So here they have these amazing capabilities, which are almost like an army. They could gather at a certain point, they could travel very great distances, they knew how to organize themselves, very different from peasant societies of China, India, or Europe. And that was the problem. On the one hand, the horses need land, they need new pastures, they need water, so the horses are very expansive. And on the other hand, the people who bred these animals knew very well how to organize long expeditions, which could eventually be military expeditions. So you can see that the steppe people were potentially a fairly scary threat for the sedentary people, and the history of their relationships with the big sedentary populations of Europe, India, Iran, and China have always been fraught by this dynamic. And I'm not blaming the steppe people for being greedy or barbarians or war crazy, but the horses would reproduce, would grow a larger and larger population, and at some point they needed to find outlets for that horsepower. So now let's go to historical times, and we'll start off, because we're talking about Europe, with the Greeks. So the ancient world knew very well about who these horse breeders were, because in those days they were common across much of what is today Europe. They lived in Romania, Bulgaria, and Thrace. The Greeks were very familiar with them. The first person who mentioned them in history is Herodotus, a Greek historian from 5th century BC, who did a great deal of ethnological description, who gave us a great deal of ethnological description about the early horse breeders, whom he knew as the Scythians. The Scythium is an Greek ethnonym for these people, and it means he who draws the bow, because their main weapon was to fight on horseback with a bow. This gentleman is not shown with a horse, but he's shown with something else which clearly identifies him as not being a Greek, because he's wearing pants. So he rides a horse. So Herodotus had many things to say about the Scythians. First, he noted that they ate milk, which no one in Greek probably does today, let alone 3,000 years ago. The Greek called them galactophagi, which means someone who eats milk. He also noted that they had a very different social system than the Greeks, that women were very important in their society and had much more freedom than in Greek society, which was very patriarchal. And he mentions the legend of the Amazons, but in fact, the legend of the Amazons is really not a legend at all. Because the men would go off to hunt or to fight for months at a time, women ran the camps, they did all the milking, they did all the shearing. If somebody attacked the camps, the women would get on horse and they knew how to shoot just like the men, and they would defend themselves. So that it's not a myth that the ancient horse-breeding women went into war. And we know in historical times the Mongol women also fought. So this is not something that Herodotus invented. He may have invented the legend of Tomyris, the great Scythian queen, who drew the Persian army deeper and deeper into the steppes in order to destroy them, and then she cut off the head of Cyrus the Great, the first king of Persia, and turned his skull into a drinking bowl to pass around the camp and remember the good old days. And what's interesting is this story about this queen who uses Cyrus's head as a drinking bowl gets repeated in steppe history over and over again, which gave them a certain reputation, the people in the steppe. The picture I'm showing you here is actually a picture of a mounted policeman in Athens, because the Athenians, who didn't really know much about riding, hired the Scythians to be the mounted police of this city. They give you an idea of the difference between the Athenians and the Scythians. The Scythians would have had hundreds of thousands, maybe 500,000 horses, and Athenian cavalry was 650. So for the Athenians, horses were not really a big thing, and we'll talk more about why later. So the ancient world knew about the steppe people, and they were in constant contact with them. There's a rich history of contact between the Greeks, the Romans, and the people who lived in Eastern Europe on horseback. In 471, however, there's kind of a breakthrough, because for the first time, this hideously deformed race of hairy horsemen show up in front of the city of Paris. And they would have killed all of us and burned the place down, except that Saint Genevieve went out and met Attila the Hun and asked him to spare the city of Paris, and that's why we're all here now. Otherwise, we'd all be gone. They would have picked Orléans or something like that as the place. Why did the Hun? Who were the Huns, and why did they come all the way to Paris? So it seems like a singularity. So the Huns were one of the many horse-breeding people who traveled from the frontiers of China to the frontiers of Rome, of the Roman Empire. And the reason is probably that in certain periods of time, the Chinese Empire entered into a period of disaggregation and chaos, and there was no good business to be made trading with China or even raiding China, because there had been so much wealth destruction that it was a desert. So the horsemen looked for opportunities elsewhere. They rode to India, and they invaded India. Then, when they were done with India, they would invade Iran. And then, kind of regular clockwork, they would wind up invading the Roman Empire. So I just mentioned the Huns as one of the many peoples who moved from all the way over in China all the way to us. Probably the prize for the person who went the furthest are the famous Alans. There are some Alans here today. The name Alan comes from this Scythian people who invaded the Roman Empire originally as mercenaries, and then they wound up, of all places, in Portugal. So that seems like a really long distance between the borders of China and Portugal, but there you go. There's an argument about whether the Huns were on horseback or on foot by the time they got to Paris. And this is really important for our later story. Personally, I believe that you cannot have a massive cavalry army this far west. There's not enough pasture to have a large army. You can have a small cavalry army, but the Huns were massive. I think the Huns left their horses in Hungary and came into Gaul, Roman province of Gaul, on foot, and they fought on foot. So they didn't have a massive tactical advantage over their Roman enemies, and the Romans did manage to defeat the Huns, and they scurried back to Hungary. But they were not the last steppe people to invade Europe. I've mentioned briefly that at the time of Charlemagne, the big problem was the Avars. The Avars also came from the borders of China. They settled in the Hungarian plains, which is the furthest west extension of the steppe. It's a great place to breed horses. The Avars prospered in the Hungarian basin for a long period of time. Charlemagne had to organize an enormous cavalry force, and we'll talk later about how hard that was for them to do, to defend Western Europe against the Avars. Couple hundred years after that, this is a famous painting from I think the Budapest Municipal building. It's the coming of the Magyars. So, and we have a Hungarian with us tonight. So the Magyars came also from far, far east for similar reasons, for the motivations as that of the Avars, as that of the Huns. This is a movie that keeps on being played. The only thing that makes the Magyars a little bit different from the Avars or the Huns is that they settled in Hungary and they're the Hungarians, right? So, but keep in mind that it seems the Hungarians are the only steppe people, but the Bulgars are also a steppe people who lost their language, so they speak a Slavic language, but originally they were steppe people. You may remember the Khazars who converted to Judaism. The Croats and the Serbs, their ruling elite may have been steppe people. So keep in mind that Eastern Europe was constantly being invaded by horse breeders who wanted more land for their horses, and they couldn't come that much further than Eastern Europe because once you get into the Alps, once you get into the Black Forest, there's no pasture. So now I want to introduce you the reaction in Western Europe, and to paraphrase a concept that was invented by a really great French writer on horses, a historian, Jean-Pierre Digard, D-I-G-A-R-D, he said there are really two kinds of ways of life. There are the chevaliers, meaning the knights, and there's the cavalier, cavaliers. If you remember Joseph Kessel's novel, The Cavalier, about the horsemen of Afghanistan, he means those people who live on horseback, who grow up on horseback. They don't walk anywhere. They ride before they learn to walk. And the chevalier. What is the big difference here? The chevalier, to become a chevalier, a knight, you had to apprentice yourself to be a page, and then you had to become a squire, and then eventually you were knighted and made a knight. But why is that? It's because they didn't know how to ride from birth, like the people on the steppe. They walked like us. They had to learn to ride the same way you and I have to learn to ride. Whereas a Mongolian probably can't even remember when he learned to ride, because he's always ridden. So that's the chevalier. And an interesting thing is that English is the only language where we don't use a word relating to horse for the word knight, because in German it's a Ritter, which is a rider, cavaliero, cavaliere. It's all about being a horseman. The word knight, I think, is related to a word meaning a young man. Anyway, our knights had a problem, which is that to raise a war horse was much more expensive and much more difficult in Western Europe than on the steppe. There is a survey of 300 lordly domains in England in the 13th century. And these 300 domains had a total of 2,400 horses. Most of those horses were cart horses or plow horses. There were only 15 riding horses, which seems crazy. And of those 15 riding horses, we don't know how many of them were actually war horses, because the big war horse that you think about, which I think in English also we call a destrier, right? Destrier, is a big horse. Creating a horse like that requires a lot of room, a lot of grooming, a lot of food, and takes a long time. So to have a destrier with like building a Porsche or a Lamborghini in our terms. And only the very wealthiest gentry could have such horses. The British were basically incapable of raising horses like that, so they typically came to France to buy their horses. They bought their horses at the Great Fair of Champagne, and that may indicate why they were reluctant to fight on horse during the 100 Years' War, because the horses were a huge investment. So they fought on foot, kept the horses safely out of the way. And that's why the French generally won battles in the 100 Years' War when cavalry could be deployed, and the French generally lost when they fought in tactical situations where there was no advantage to be on horseback. So that's the story of the chevalier. Then, in Eastern Europe, I'll go back to the cavaliers. Here's a picture of a Polish or Hungarian king with his knights fighting the steppe people. You notice that the steppe people are fighting with bows and arrows, and the knights have lances. I forgot to mention that there's a theory that the steppe people brought the stirrup to Western Europe, and this is what created the knight with heavy armor, and that's called the Great Stirrup Controversy. So tonight we don't have time to go into it, but I'd just like to say that irrespective of whether the stirrup created feudal chivalry or not, the Western Europeans always wore heavy armor and fought with lances, and the steppe people tended to avoid hand-to-hand combat. They tried to surround the enemy and pick him off with arrows, which is what they're doing here. So the cavaliers were still a very big part of the demography of Eastern Europe. And depicted here are a group called the Cumans, or the Kipchaks. They're also called the Polovtsian. You may recall the Polovtsian dances from the opera Prince Igor. Those are all the Turkic people that were raiding or trading on the eastern frontiers of Europe. And there were a lot of them. The population of Hungary and Poland, there were probably 20 or 30% of these guys in the 13th century. And that is too bad, because that's what brought the Mongols on us. The Kipchak Turks extended in those days from Eastern Europe way into the steppe. And the easternmost ones came in contact with Genghis Khan, and they refused to submit to him. And so he destroyed them, and the refugees fled into Europe. And then the Mongols came to the frontiers of Europe, and they said to the kings of Poland, the kings of Hungary, and the princes of the Romanian principalities, hand over these people. They are our disobedient servants. We have to punish them. And because of civil honor and stuff like that, the kings of Poland and Hungary said, no, we're not going to do that. That was a big mistake. The Mongols invaded and devastated Eastern Europe for about 150 years. It would have been better to give them up, honestly. We have a whole discussion about people not doing things that are good for them in the long run. So you may ask, why were the Mongols so powerful, and why were they able to conquer so much of Eastern Europe? The simple answer is they had performed a roll-up by getting all of the horse-breeding people on their side, which meant that their armies were vaster than anything anyone previously had put into the field. They probably had 1 million horsemen at various times invading China, India, Iran, the Ottoman Empire, or early Ottoman Empire, and Eastern Europe. So they were basically unbeatable. And the devastation that they caused completely changed Eastern Europe, created Eastern Europe in a way. Here's a picture of some Polish landowners visiting their horse stud in what is now Western Ukraine, Podolia, and we'll come back to why Podolia is important in a second. So it changed Eastern Europe dramatically. For one thing, it depopulated Eastern Europe such that the kings of Hungary and Poland didn't have any subjects. So what did they do? They recruited colonists from Western Europe, and that's the origin of the Jewish and German communities that were settled all over Poland, Romania, and Hungary up until World War II, they were basically brought there to repopulate the countries which had been destroyed by the Mongols. The other thing that changed is that Poland, which in the Middle Ages was more like Czech Republic, it was more like a Central European country focused on its German and Czech neighbors, they saw this big opportunity to conquer land back from the Mongols as the Mongol power declined, and they expanded way far eastward, way into the steppe, and became a major horse breeding country with their own horse breeding peoples. The great landowners, of course, owned huge herds of horses, which were famous, and they sold horses all over Europe as late as the 1930s. I'm talking about the Radzivils, the Lubomirskis, and the Potocskis. Funny thing is, all those families had palaces here in Paris. The Chambre de Commerce de la Ville de Paris, I think, is the Pototsky mansion. But they were a lot of their wealth came from selling horses. I could go on and on about selling horses, but you have to read the book. So Poland, Lithuania became one of the major horse breeding countries of the time, and everything would have been good for them except that there was another power that arose at the same time further north, talking about Moscow, and they were even more obviously a Mongol successor state. Out of the ruins of the Mongol Empire, Moscow arose and became very successful. And this is one of the surprising things I learned when I was researching the book. They became a huge horse market. Moscow was the biggest horse market east of Beijing. And the growing power of the Tsar of Moscow manifested itself in a really tricky way vis-a-vis Poland. That is, in the mid-17th century, the Grand Duke, the Tsar of Moscow, managed to get the horse-breeding people of the Ukraine to change their allegiance from the Poles to him. And this is when, so to speak, Ukraine became part of the Russian Empire versus part of the Polish state. So it has huge implications even to our day. These horse-breeding people who the Tsars managed to pull on side are, of course, the Cossacks. And the fact that the Cossacks became part of the Russian Empire enabled them to expand hugely, both east and west. So the rise of Moscow has a lot to do with getting the horsepower of the Cossacks on board and using it as a military force, both against the Tartars in the east, the Mongols in the east, and the Poles and others in the west. This is an interesting picture. It shows Ivan the Terrible inviting the British ambassador, whose name is Horsey of all things, to his treasury in the Kremlin. Has anyone visited the treasury armory and the armory in the Kremlin? It's a wonderful, wonderful display of Asian horse tack. So just a couple things on this detail. They have beautiful saddles. Now I'm off the camera. They have beautiful saddles, beautiful weapons, and all these artifacts were gifts or plunder from the horse breeders of the steppe. So you see how oriental, in a way, how Asian Moscow was. Remember, in the words of Napoleon, scratch a Russian and get a Tatar. So that's what he's talking about. The other thing I want to say about Ivan the Terrible is he insisted that the people in the steppe call him the Great White Khan. So white, unrelated to the Great White Father of American Indian lore, Great White meant that stood for the cardinal direction west. So effectively he was saying he was the Great Khan of the West, just like the Mongols were the Great Khans of the East. So the Russians were very conscious of being a steppe power and succeeding in the place of Genghis Khan. I want to take a quick segue away from the steppe for a second to show you that no matter where you go, you come back to horsepower. This is the picture of a specially designed, a model of a specially designed Portuguese ship that was that the Portuguese used to bring horses from the Persian Gulf to Goa, to the west coast of India, which they sold to the Indians Now, the ship was 3 or 4 times bigger than anything the local ship makers could make. It had special cleaning arrangements. It had special security for the horses to make sure that 85% of the horses showed up healthy and safe in India. This made the Portuguese immensely wealthy. We think of Portuguese wealth being based on spices or on porcelain, but according to the Viceroy of India himself, writing to King Don John III, Your Majesty should know that this is our most profitable trade, because you can buy a horse in Persia and sell it in India for 6 times what you paid for it. So the gold churches, the Baroque altars of Goa were all paid for by the horse trade. So I'm going to try to connect back to the steppe for a second. The Portuguese learned that the real money was to be made in Europe was maritime. Then the Spanish followed them, then the British, then the Dutch, then the French. And also, if you think about it, all the great empires of antiquity, the Athenians, the Romans, the Carthaginians, and in the Middle Ages, the Venetians, the Genovese, the Aragonese, it was all based on maritime power. Horses were absolutely not important for wealth creation in Western Europe. So nobody in Western Europe really cared about having a big land empire like the Mongols or indeed like the Russians. But then Napoleon decided to invade Russia. So that seems contradictory. But think about this. Napoleon could care less whether the French Empire extended all the way east. He had very little interest in it. But he was trying to impose a maritime blockade on Great Britain and deny the British the ability to trade with Europe. A little bit like what the British did in 2016. So he had to invade Russia because Russia was the big player which refused to go along with the boycott of British trade. And he made massive preparations to invade Russia. Remember, the Grande Armée had 600,000 troops. It had 20,000 cavalry, probably 50,000 horses. But this turned out to be peanuts, because by the time Napoleon got to Moscow in the winter of 1812, he had no more horses left. And what was worse is he had no way of replacing them. It's funny, he was able to reconstitute an army in 1813 by just bringing in more recruits, but there were no horses. He had used all the horses that were available to him in Western Europe. The Russian Empire was quite different. In preparation for war, already in 1810, the Russians established very big stud farms in southern Russia, very far away from any area that could be threatened by foreign invasion, and they had tens of thousands of horses. So right at the spring of 1813, when Napoleon was in full retreat, he was being pursued by hundreds and hundreds of squadrons of freshly mounted Russian troops, and the French had no cavalry. They had no idea what was out there. Napoleon only very narrowly managed to escape capture by Cossacks because the French had no screen of horsemen. And this unfortunate cuirassier is being lassoed, which is a typical steppe offensive weapon. He's being lassoed by Cossacks. So this victory in 1814 made it clear to Europeans that Russia was the premier military power in the world. And people realized that they had more horses than anybody in Europe could even possibly imagine mustering. And therefore, you must not invade Russia, and you have to be very careful about Russia. And in 1914, when Germany and France went to war, the Germans were quaking in their boots that this unstoppable new Mongol horde would just ride into Berlin. There was literally nothing to stop such a massive cavalry army as the Russians had in 1914. 100 years later, everyone said, this is going to be the same thing. They're going to ride into Berlin instead of riding into Paris. But there was one difference between 1814, and the Mongols, and the outbreak of World War I. That is, that the Mongols went to war when the horses were ready. They attacked when the horses were ready. Alexander I had to have Napoleon get all the way to Moscow before his horses were ready, but when they were ready, then he was able to destroy Napoleon. In 1914, the Russians, out of a tremendous sense of loyalty to France, decided to attack Germany before they had any horses. All the horses were in farms, thousands of miles away from the German border. So they attacked without this very important cavalry screen, without any ability to surround or to invade or to disrupt. And they were roundly defeated at the Battle of the Mazovian Lakes. This is described very well in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's novel, August 1914. And that was really a death knell for Russia's military prestige. If they had simply waited 6 months, they probably could have destroyed Germany. Turning to Paris again, also August 1914. Maybe you recognize these are the taxis parisiens. This is the Miracle of the Marne. Now, the Miracle of the Marne was not really, the taxis were not really decisive. Most of the French troops who pushed back Germany in 1914 walked to the front or took trains to the front. But the psychological impact of the taxis parisiens was very important. It's the only nice thing anyone can remember thinking about les taxis parisiens. And also, it kind of was a signal that this might be the future of military power. And if you think about the civilian context at the time, 1914, we were already abandoning the horse as a civilian means of transportation very abruptly. The horses were disappearing from the city, from the streets of Paris, because horses get sick, horses make a mess, horses are hard to dispose of. The economics of having a car versus a horse are very good, and it only took a few years for horses to disappear from the streets of all the big cities. It took much longer in military terms, simply because the productive capabilities of the European countries was not great enough to replace the horses. So everyone comes back at me when I say that 1914 was the end of the horses, and they say, yeah, but Hitler used 1.5 million horses during his war against the Soviet Union. It's true, but that's because Germany was a third-rate industrial power and did not have the luxury of being fully mechanized. But look at the British Army in World War II and the American Army. We didn't use horses for transportation. So the writing was on the wall that horsepower was not going to, it didn't allow Russia to win World War I, and it didn't, it eventually lost its military importance, which has actually fairly significant implications. So let's talk about the horse today, just briefly. What happened to all these horsemen that we've been talking about for 3,000 years? So first, horses lose their military importance. That means a huge loss of prestige, a huge loss of investment of states in maintaining horsepower. The Soviets then sedentarized the horse-breeding peoples, the Kazakhs, the Cossacks, the Turkmen, and so forth. They sedentarized them. They took away their horses. They said, we don't need horses for any more. You need to grow. You need to raise sheep. It resulted in a massive loss of both human and animal life. There were terrible famines across the whole steppe belt. Same thing happened in Mongolia based on Soviet advice. And so this horse people basically disappeared from history. And they're making feeble attempts today to reconstitute their way of life because it's ecologically extremely sensible. And I think today is maybe a little bit of a comeback for the horse-breeding people. But I told you I was going to tell you what was the legacy of the steppe horse in Europe. So what, after the horsemen themselves disappeared, why is it that the Soviet Empire was pushed to this line between Trieste and Lübeck, the Iron Curtain? So if you think about Stalin for a second, remember that he was a Georgian. The Georgian national epic is called The Horsemen in Panther Skin. The capital of Georgia, Tbilisi, was totally destroyed by the Mongols. And again, totally destroyed by by Tamerlane, and totally destroyed by the Iranians several times. So the Georgians are very, very familiar with the idea of these aggressive Asian-based powers that just take over everything and have no regard for the opinion of the people living there. So he understood that Russia was a Mongol successor state, and he understood that the Mongols have a very deep legacy in Eastern Europe. So for him, it seemed very natural for the Soviet Union to have a zone of control that corresponded to the Mongol zone of control 500 years later. So that's my hypothesis. I wouldn't have said that except the Russians are invading Ukraine. And it seemed like, again, they're just assuming that that part of the world belonged to them because it belonged to the Mongols. So I think even if the horse of the steppe is not literally running loose in Eastern Europe, in Bloch's and Alexander Bloch's sense, the horse of the steppe is running on in a metaphorical sense in Russia's invasion of Eastern Europe. So with that, I thank you and I open up for questions.
Thank you.
All right, who has a question? Don't be shy. Oh, yes.
Thank you so much. This is Maddie. It was fantastic. I learned a lot about the history of this region, about the whole region of the steppe and Europe and Central South Asia. I'm working on China's foreign policy towards Central South Asia. In the history, there is somebody called Zhang Qian in 2nd BC. He was sent by Han Emperor for a mission toward Central South Asia. Then on his way, he found there is heavenly horses. So after that, with these heavenly horses, Han Dynasty was able to somehow conquer Xiannu. So with your understanding of horse and the history of the conquering, is that correct to claim that Han Dynasty was able to expand towards Central South Asia and be somehow a great dynasty? It was because of horse. Can we claim such a story or not?
Sure. That's an excellent question, and I discuss the story of the heavenly horses very extensively in the book. The Han Chinese, just like the Roman Empire, didn't have a huge reservoir of horses for ecological reasons, so they wound up searching for more powerful horses very far west in what is today Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. And they accomplished several things by doing that, but the main thing they did is they started a horse trade with the South Central steppe. And using those horses, and also the horsemen themselves as mercenaries, they were able to build up a sufficiently big cavalry army to protect their northern frontier and to push back the horse breeders who were raiding China. And the Roman Empire did the same thing. They hired mercenaries on the steppe and used them to keep the wilder steppe people further away. So there's great parallelism between the politics of the Han Chinese and the politics of the Roman Empire. And I think that, not a topic I just went into in great detail in the book, but it's really interesting you raised the question. Thank you.
Another question?
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. I'm going to be traveling to northern Mongolia this summer for an archaeological expedition, and I'll be traveling a lot on horseback. And I was wondering if you had any advice for me on my trip.
Well, congratulations. It's very exciting. So the main problem with long horseback expeditions is that your muscles are not ready for it at the beginning, and you can't walk for days and days after starting. So if you have a Pilates class or a stretching class, I would do something to try to get those muscles in shape, loose and in shape. And also maybe your Pilates teacher could, we didn't have that in my day, but you could maybe ask him or her for some exercises to do at night when you get off the horse, because I find that is the biggest issue.
Just curious why you live in Portugal. There's a history of horses in Portugal, so I was curious how long you lived there. And
so I'm discovering the history. Thank you for that question. I'm discovering the history of Portugal's horses. It's quite amazing. They had one of the great schools of equestrian art in Europe that went kind of down after the revolution in 1974, because anything associated with the upper class was considered to be bad, and they decided it would be better to be more like modern Americans. But they're kind of recovering it. We moved to Portugal because we thought we moved to Lisbon because we thought it's a major city, it's very cultural, and it's 20 minutes from the beach. And if you've ever driven from Paris to Normandy, then you understand why we live in Lisbon.
Do we have another question?
Oh.
You didn't mention Middle East.
Yeah.
Can you develop about Middle East?
Oh,
also
okay.
The croisade.
Yeah.
Also.
Yeah. The Middle East is a funny concept because it's not very well defined. In my book, I talk a lot about Iran because Iran is kind of a frontline state versus the steppe. It has it has about 1,200 mile long frontier with the steppe. So it's intimately connected with the history of the steppe. You remember that the Mongols invaded Syria and tried to invade Egypt, and they ran out of gas in the same way that the Hungarians and the Avars ran out of gas when they invaded Western Europe. There just was not enough pasture land for the Mongols to establish themselves securely in Syria and Iraq. That's why they stayed in what is today Iran, Azerbaijan, and Turkey. In terms of the Crusaders and their enemies, mostly the Egyptians mainly, neither of those are really steppe related, because Crusaders obviously had, the horses, the destriers I talked about, and the Egyptians had very powerful horses, which were also very, artificially brought up like Western horses. It's not a place where the vast horsepower of the steppe could be deployed. So the Mongols tried and failed. The Egyptians and the Franks had a go at it. But it wasn't the horse wasn't a hugely decisive factor. Most of the Crusades was about sieges, I believe. And it's not a great horse country for cavalry, I guess. Hope that maybe answers the question a little bit.
Sir?
Thank you. David, isn't it true that even as late as the Second World War, the Polish cavalry, mounted cavalry, were still attacking German tanks, or trying to attack German tanks?
So I have been told, I think by Norman Davies, who maybe some of you know is a well-known historian of the 20th century in Poland in particular, that the Germans wanted to make fun of, they wanted the world to ridiculize the Poles. So they purposely made newsreels that suggested that the Poles were attacking armored divisions with cavalry, but they weren't. The Poles also, the Germans also had mounted units during the campaign of Poland, and I think both sides were good enough military officers to know where you would use and where you wouldn't use cavalry. The Poles Polish officers at the higher levels remember, they'd fought in the Russian army, they'd fought in the German army, they'd fought in the Austrian army, they'd seen service in World War I, all of them. So tactically, they were pretty capable.